Imagine praying so hard, so silently, that someone watching you thinks you're drunk. That actually happened to a woman named Hannah more than 3,000 years ago in a quiet hill town in ancient Israel. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't famous for anything, except one thing. She wanted a child so badly that her grief became a kind of prayer the world had never seen before. This is her story. And by the end of it, you'll understand why a woman nobody expected to matter ended up changing the entire course of a nation. Let's go back to a town called Ramah in the hill country of Ephraim. There was a man named Elkanah. He wasn't a king, wasn't a priest, wasn't anybody particularly powerful. Just a regular man from Ramah, from a respected family, living an ordinary life, except for one detail that made his household anything but peaceful. Elkanah had 2 wives. This wasn't unusual for the time period, even if it strikes us as strange today. What made it hard wasn't the arrangement itself. It was what came with it. One wife, named Peninnah, had children, several of them. The other wife, named Hannah, had none. And in that culture, that mattered enormously. Having children wasn't just a personal joy back then. It was security, status, identity, even survival in old age. A woman without children was often seen as a woman without worth, fair or not. So imagine living every single day in a house where the other woman has exactly what you want most in the world, and doesn't let you forget it. Because Peninnah didn't just have children. She used the fact that she had them as a weapon. The Bible describes it plainly. Peninnah provoked Hannah. Not once, not occasionally, year after year. Every time the family made their yearly trip to worship at Shiloh, which was the site of the tabernacle, the closest thing Israel had to a central place of worship before the temple was built, Peninnah would twist the knife. She'd make comments. She'd make sure Hannah felt her emptiness in front of everyone. Try to sit with that for a second. This wasn't a one-time cruel comment Hannah could shake off and move past. This was a woman who had to face the same humiliation, the same reminder of her pain, on what was supposed to be one of the most sacred days of her year, a pilgrimage to worship God. Her deepest wound got reopened annually, like clockwork, at the exact moment she was trying to be closest to God. That's the setting. That's the wound this story opens with. The text tells us that when the family would gather for the sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Elkanah would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and to each of her children. But to Hannah he gave a double portion. Not because he pitied her, but because, as the Bible puts it plainly, he loved her. There's a moment where Elkanah, clearly troubled by watching his wife suffer year after year, asks her a question that's become one of the most quietly heartbreaking lines in the whole story. He says to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart grieved? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" Now, on the surface, that might sound almost sweet. A husband trying to comfort his wife, reminding her she's loved regardless of children. And there probably was real tenderness behind it. But if you've ever been in deep pain and had someone who loves you try to reason you out of it, "But don't you have me? Isn't that enough?" You know that kind of comfort, however well-intentioned, doesn't actually reach the wound. Grief isn't solved by logic. Elkanah's love was real, but it wasn't the thing Hannah needed healed. So year after year, this cycle repeated. The family would travel to Shiloh. Peninnah would provoke her. Elkanah would try to comfort her in his limited way. And Hannah would weep and refuse to eat, carrying a grief that nobody around her, not her rival, not even her loving husband, could actually touch. Until one particular year something changed. Not in her circumstances, in her. This particular year, after the family's meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up, deeply distressed, in bitterness of soul, the text says, and she went to the entrance of the tabernacle to pray. Now here's something important to understand about prayer in that culture. It was often done out loud, vocalized, public, even communal. What Hannah did next was, in its own quiet way, radical. She prayed silently. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. She wasn't performing a ritual. She wasn't reciting something memorized. This was raw, unfiltered, wordless anguish being poured out directly to God. So intense that she couldn't even form the words out loud. She just let it pour out of her, silently, desperately. And she made a vow while she prayed. She said, essentially, God, if you will look upon my suffering, and remember me and give me a son, I will give him back to you. He will be dedicated to your service, his whole life, and no razor will ever touch his head. Meanwhile, sitting nearby, watching all of this, was a priest named Eli. He was the head priest at Shiloh at the time, an old man who had served there for years. And Eli watched Hannah, her lips moving, no words coming out, her whole body shaking with the intensity of her prayer, and he came to the wrong conclusion entirely. He thought she was drunk. He walked over and said to her, essentially, how long are you going to go on like this? Put away your wine. Now imagine being Hannah in that moment. You are already carrying years of humiliation. You've just poured out the rawest, most desperate prayer of your life. And the one person who's supposed to represent spiritual authority, the priest himself, looks at you and assumes you're drunk in a holy place. It would have been so easy for her to shut down here, to feel humiliated one more time, by one more person who misunderstood her pain. She said, no, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have not been drinking wine or strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. And Eli, to his credit, listened. He didn't double down defensively. He said, go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. Simple words, but they landed on Hannah like a released breath. The text says that after that, she went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Nothing had actually changed yet. She still wasn't pregnant. Nothing about her circumstances was different in that moment. But something in her had shifted. She had said the unspeakable thing out loud, or rather silently but fully, and she had been heard. Not just by Eli, by God. The family returned home to Ramah. And in time, the text is careful to say it was the Lord who remembered her. Hannah conceived. She had a son. She named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries a meaning connected to heard by God or asked of God. A name that was, essentially, a permanent reminder etched into her son's very identity. This child exists because a desperate woman was heard. Now here's where the story does something you might not expect. You'd think the next scene would be Hannah, finally a mother, savoring every second with the child she waited years for. And in a sense she did, but only for a set, deliberate window of time. When the next yearly pilgrimage to Shiloh came around, Hannah didn't go. She told Elkanah she would wait until the boy was weaned, meaning old enough to be off nursing, typically somewhere around age 2 or 3 in that culture, and only then would she bring him to Shiloh. And when she did, she said, she would present him there permanently. Not for a visit, for good. Elkanah's response is quietly touching. He simply said, do what seems best to you. Only may the Lord establish his word. He didn't fight her on it. He didn't try to talk her out of the vow, even though it meant giving up the son they'd waited years for. So Hannah nursed Samuel, raised him through those earliest years. The years every parent knows are packed with first steps, first words, the fierce, particular love of caring for a small child who depends on you for everything. And then, when he was weaned, she did exactly what she vowed she would do. She took him to Shiloh. She brought an offering. And she stood in front of Eli, the very same priest who once accused her of being drunk, and said something remarkable. She said, oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And then, and this is the part that stops people in their tracks every time they hear this story, she left him there. She walked away without her son. A boy who was maybe 2 or 3 years old, at most, stayed behind at Shiloh to be raised in the service of the tabernacle, under the care of Eli, while his mother went home without him. And here's something worth noticing. This wasn't abandonment. Shiloh wasn't far from Ramah. Hannah wasn't erasing herself from her son's life. She was giving him to a sacred calling, one she then continued to actively support, which we'll get to in a moment. But make no mistake, Leaving your small child in someone else's care, even a good and holy care, when you have wanted nothing more than to be his mother, is a real and lasting sacrifice. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat that. It just shows her doing it anyway. Before Hannah leaves Shiloh that day, something beautiful happens. She prays again. But this time it's not a silent, desperate, wordless anguish. This time it's out loud. It's a song. A song of praise, often called Hannah's Song. And it's one of the most powerful pieces of poetry in the entire Old Testament. It doesn't just thank God for a baby. It goes far bigger than that. She sings about how God humbles the proud and lifts up the lowly. How the God she serves brings down the mighty and raises the poor from the dust.
My heart is in the Lord.
Hannah's song wasn't just personal gratitude. It was a bigger declaration. That the God who heard one anxious, weeping, misunderstood woman at the doorway of a tabernacle is a God who consistently favors the humble over the powerful, the desperate over the comfortable. She wasn't just celebrating that she got a son. She was declaring something about the character of God himself, using her own story as proof. So what happened next? Hannah went home. But the story doesn't just end there, and neither does her role. Every year, when the family made their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah made Samuel a little robe. The text specifically mentions this small, tender detail and brought it to him. Picture that. A mother who only gets to see her son once a year, and instead of despairing over the distance, she spends the months in between sewing him a robe with her own hands, so that when she does see him, she has something to give him. Something made specifically for him by her. It's a small detail, but it says everything about the kind of love this was. Not absent, not detached, just love expressed within the limits of a promise she'd chosen to keep. And Eli, the priest, actually blessed Elkanah and Hannah for this. He said, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the son she has lent to the Lord." In other words, because you gave this one up so completely, may you be given more. And that's exactly what happened. The text tells us Hannah went on to have 5 more children, 3 more sons and 2 daughters. The woman who once sat childless year after year, mocked and misunderstood, ended up with a full household. Not instead of Samuel. In addition to the sacrifice she made with Samuel. As for Samuel himself, the boy grew up at Shiloh under Eli's care, in the presence of God's tabernacle. And he didn't just grow up to be an ordinary man. Samuel became one of the most significant figures in all of Israel's history. He became a prophet, one of the last of the judges who led Israel before it had kings, and eventually the man who anointed both of Israel's first 2 kings, Saul and then David. Yes, that David. The one who would become the greatest king in Israel's history, from whose line, centuries later, according to Christian tradition, Jesus himself would eventually come. Sit with that for a second. All of it, the entire trajectory that leads toward the kingship of David, traces back through Samuel. And Samuel exists because a grieving, humiliated, overlooked woman once stood at a doorway, moved her lips without sound, and refused to stop pouring out her heart to God. Nobody watching Hannah in her lowest moment, mocked by her husband's other wife, misunderstood by the priest himself, could have possibly guessed that they were witnessing the beginning of a story that would ripple through the entire history of a nation. Maybe it's this. Her pain wasn't wasted, even in the years before anything changed. Her grief, her humiliation, the years of being misunderstood, none of that was erased by the happy ending. It was carried into it. The woman who sang that triumphant song at Shiloh was the same woman who once couldn't even speak her prayer out loud. Maybe it's also this. Real faith doesn't always look like certainty. Sometimes it looks like a woman with trembling lips, not sure if anyone's even listening, pouring out everything anyway. And maybe, finally, it's this, keeping a hard promise, even one that costs you something you desperately wanted, can end up being the very thing that makes your story matter far beyond your own life. Hannah never became a queen. She never led an army. She never wrote a law. All she did was pray honestly, love faithfully, and keep her word. And through that one quiet, weeping, unshakable woman, an entire nation's future was set in motion. That's Hannah's story. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one still to tell.